In the winter of 1942, as the North African desert hardened under the shifting winds, an overlooked truth defined the fate of entire armies. A handful of men, operating in the dark, could change the course of a continent-wide war. The British Special Air Service, barely a year old, had already carved a reputation for impossible raids carried out far behind enemy lines. But few outside intelligence circles knew that the success of those missions often hinged on fragments of weather reports, incomplete reconnaissance photos, and rumors traded between desert tribes. It was within this fragile mosaic that a series of SAS night raids, meant to undermine the Axis foothold, began to unravel with chilling precision. For the men of the SAS, every operation started with the same struggle: uncertainty. Navigating hundreds of kilometers of open desert at night required discipline bordering on obsession. Lieutenant David Stanning of L Detachment later wrote, "You don't see the desert at night, you feel it. Every dune is a rumor, every shadow a warning." In late November 1942, orders arrived for a coordinated set of night raids targeting German-held airfields near Benghazi and Tobruk. The goal was clear: destroy Luftwaffe aircraft before the impending Allied push toward Tripoli. But within the secrecy of the briefing tents, whispers circulated about conflicting intelligence reports. Aerial reconnaissance suggested increased German presence near Burqa and Tmini, but intercepted communications painted a different picture. The fields were supposedly understrength, undersupplied, and vulnerable. The friction between these narratives weighed heavily on the men preparing for the mission. The SAS relied on pinpoint timing, driving under moonless skies, hitting from unexpected angles, and vanishing into the desert before aircraft warmed on enemy runways. Yet no one could explain why a normally reliable informant network had suddenly gone quiet. Nomadic tribes who often provided early warning of German movements reported new patrols and listening trucks sweeping deeper into the interior. What those terms meant was unclear, but their message was unmistakable. The Axis was probing in places it had previously ignored. As the night of the operation approached, the strain inside the unit grew palpable. Captain Robert Jacques Louis, the SAS tactical mastermind, had spent the early war years designing the time charges that became standard for aircraft sabotage. But he remained uneasy. His field notes from December 13th contain a cryptic line: patterns changing, patrols reconfiguring, Luftwaffe more alert than reports suggest. That single entry would later fuel questions about just how much the SAS leadership sensed trouble before the raids even launched. The men rolled out on the evening of December 15th in modified jeeps armed with Vickers K machine guns, extra fuel drums lashed to their sides. Their movement relied on the desert's natural camouflage, dust dispersing into the cold night, engines muffled under canvas wraps. For hours, everything matched the plan. But shortly after midnight, the first sign of danger emerged. Tire tracks, fresh, deep, and heading southwest toward the very route the SAS intended to use. Stanning recorded the moment with eerie clarity: tracks where none should be. They did not belong to us. Yet they knew the way. This discovery unsettled even the veterans. German patrols rarely ventured so far from supply lines unless tipped off about enemy movement. But with no time to confirm suspicions, the SAS pressed on. Their target, Burqa airfield, lay ahead, and the window for the raid was closing. The deeper context behind this moment would only surface decades later. Declassified fragments from British Middle East Command suggested that, in early December, at least one encrypted transmission involving SAS deployment estimates was wrongly routed and potentially deciphered by Axis monitoring stations in Crete. Whether this directly connected to the patrol patterns observed on the ground remains debated among historians. Still, the timing was uncanny. The intelligence slip occurred within days of the Luftwaffe reinforcing security measures along the Cyrenaican corridor. As the SAS approached the final staging point, the desert wind intensified, dragging thin layers of sand across compass lenses. Navigation slowed. The jeeps crawled over ridges, headlights covered, drivers leaning out to read the darkness by feel. Every man knew that survival depended on timing. If they arrived too early, German watchmen might still be awake. Too late, and first light would expose them on open ground. And then the unexpected struck. A distant engine hum, unmistakably German, echoed across the plateau. It was moving in a wide arc as if searching, not patrolling. The SAS halted, engines killed, men sinking into sand for cover. The German vehicle passed without slowing, but its path felt deliberate, almost as if it were mapping the very terrain the British used for approach routes. That brush with detection marked the moment where anticipation shifted into unease. Something was different tonight. Something was watching. When the engines restarted and the convoy pushed onward toward Burqa, no one spoke. They were committed. But a new tension hung in the air, a sense that the desert was no longer the silent ally it once had been. And when the first flare lit the sky above Burqa airfield the following night, it would confirm what many had already feared. The enemy was waiting. In the hidden war of the North African desert, intelligence failures rarely announced themselves with clarity. They revealed their presence in subtle, unnerving ways: an unexpected patrol, a misplaced track, a silence where information was supposed to be. As the SAS convoys continued their covert advance toward the Burqa and Tmini airfields in mid-December 1942, one unsettling truth became increasingly clear. The German Afrika Korps was behaving in ways the British did not anticipate. And nothing unnerved an SAS raider more than an enemy who suddenly changed the rules. For the men in the jeeps, the desert night was usually predictable, vast, dead quiet, broken only by the hum of engines and the whisper of sand against canvas. But on December 16, several patrol leaders reported seeing signs of German mobility far deeper into the interior than previously recorded. Corporal Ian McCree described it as a map that had been redrawn overnight, with tire tracks leading toward remote wadis the Axis had never patrolled before. It was a breach of the established rhythm, and in war pattern changes are rarely coincidences. Navigation became a contest between instinct and outdated intelligence briefings. The SAS route, planned meticulously to avoid known Axis checkpoints, now placed them at risk of running directly into roving motorized patrols. Thomas Mayfield, a radio operator assigned to Captain Jellicoe's section, later recalled, "It felt like the desert was whispering that something had gone wrong, but we didn't know how wrong until much later." These men were trained to read the terrain like a book, yet the pages now seemed rearranged. Compounding the tension was a troubling observation. At two different rest points, the SAS teams encountered fresh tire tracks that did not match their own vehicles. The treads were German, likely from a KFZ-15 field car or a light reconnaissance vehicle. The tracks led south, toward the very corridor the SAS had intended to use for their withdrawal. For seasoned raiders, this could mean only one thing: either the Germans had learned their route or they were guessing with uncanny accuracy. To understand what the SAS was experiencing, it's important to view the moment within the larger intelligence picture of the North African campaign. By late 1942, German signals intelligence had become increasingly adept at triangulating British radio transmissions. Though the SAS followed strict communication silence during operations, planning stages often involved coordination with RAF reconnaissance units and long-range desert group scouts. Historians later debated whether certain encoded messages intercepted during this window were deciphered quickly enough to alert the Afrika Korps about unusual British interest in specific areas east of Benghazi. The men on the ground felt the consequences of this intelligence vulnerability long before the paperwork revealed it. At dusk that evening, while navigating a shallow depression near Sidi Rezeg, one SS patrol spotted something that chilled them: footprints in the sand for maybe 5 men, leading from a small escarpment to an open plateau, then disappearing abruptly. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of a struggle. Just footprints ending as if the men walked into air. Most likely, the tracks had been swept out by wind beyond the visible area, but to the soldiers in that moment, it felt like an ominous warning that someone else was studying the same terrain with equal stealth. As morale tightened, so did operational discipline. The SAS halted more frequently to listen for distant engines, using stethoscopes pressed to the sand, an old desert trick, to detect vibrations. More than once they picked up faint rumblings, though whether they were German patrols or natural echoes remained unclear. Still, every pause chipped away at their narrow timing window. If they fell behind schedule, the Burqa and Tmini raids would lose their element of surprise. Inside the command jeep, Captain Jellicoe reviewed the intelligence packet yet again. The most recent aerial photos, taken by a reconnaissance Spitfire, showed minimal personnel movement at Burqa airfield. But 2 of his section leaders insisted the Germans had increased sentry rotations based on glimpsed silhouettes around old Italian bunkers. The contradiction gnawed at Jellicoe's confidence. His later memoir noted, "The desert was not lying to us. Someone else was." Some historians now believe that the Luftwaffe had quietly reinforced the airfields with additional Feldgendarmerie units, information that never reached the SAS before the raid. Then came one of the most chilling moments of the advance. Shortly after midnight, as the jeeps moved in a staggered column, a small glow appeared on the horizon. Not a flare too steady. Not headlights too dim. Through binoculars, Captain Lewis identified it as a German inspection lamp, mounted on a vehicle that was driving a slow, deliberate grid pattern. As if marking the desert, he wrote. This raised the possibility that the Germans were not just patrolling, they were searching. Whether this was coincidence or indication that Axis forces knew the SAS was inbound remains one of the unresolved mysteries of the operation. But for the men watching that lonely light sweep across the night, the message was unmistakable. Someone on the other side was expecting trouble. As the convoy cut engines and waited for the German vehicle to pass, the desert fell into absolute silence. No one breathed. No one moved. The lamp drifted closer, then pivoted unexpectedly, tracing a path parallel to the SAS column before fading into the night. Only when the wind picked up did the men exhale. When the jeeps finally rolled forward again, the question lingered unspoken among them. Had they narrowly avoided detection or been deliberately allowed to pass? They would learn the answer soon enough, when the first German flare lit the Burqa airfield like a torch. In war, nothing feels more jarring than the moment the enemy reveals they've been studying you all along. For the SAS raiders approaching Burqa airfield on the night of December 17, 1942, that revelation came with a burst of white light, sudden, blinding, and unmistakably intentional. The flare that rose above the airfield was not a random illumination. It was a signal. And for the men waiting in the shadows, it confirmed a fear that had been growing since the first mysterious patrol sightings earlier in the journey. The Germans knew they were coming. The approach to Burqa had been planned with precision. Intelligence suggested that the Luftwaffe maintained a modest deployment there, mostly Ju-87 Stukas and a handful of Mi-110s, guarded by lightly manned sentry posts. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the perimeter, plant Lewis bombs on fuel drums and aircraft, then withdraw before first light. But as the SAS jeeps halted 3 kilometers from the wire, the atmosphere felt wrong. The airfield was too quiet, too still. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Captain David Sterling, though not present at this particular raid, had often warned his men, when silence feels unnatural, assume the worst. The men in the forward jeeps whispered similar sentiments to one another. They had trained to decipher subtle environmental shifts, how engine maintenance crews behaved at night, how searchlights swept at regular intervals, how sentries smoked their cigarettes to break boredom. Here, none of those familiar signs appeared. Instead, the perimeter was dark, the guard towers empty-looking as if deliberately staged. As the raiders dismounted to push forward on foot, a metallic click echoed from somewhere beyond the wire. Lance Corporal Mayfield later described it as a sound that didn't belong to the desert. A second later, a bright flare soared above the runway, washing the entire field and its surroundings with daylight intensity. The SAS team froze as the flare drifted downward, revealing an unmistakably hostile scene. Machine gun nests repositioned behind sandbags, German soldiers poised behind anti-aircraft emplacements, and patrols sweeping the area with Mauser rifles at the ready. What made the moment more chilling was the discipline of the German response. They did not open fire immediately. Instead, they held position as though waiting to confirm whether the shapes in the dark were intruders or shadows. It was only when a jeep engine sputtered, perhaps a startled driver making a split-second mistake, that the Germans unleashed a torrent of bullets across the dunes. Chaos erupted. Men dove for cover behind scrub brush and shallow rises in the sand. The Vickers K guns mounted on the jeeps roared back, spitting dense bursts of fire toward the airfield perimeter. But the element of surprise, the SAS' most potent weapon, was gone. Corporal Ian McCree recalled firing blindly into the glare, unable to distinguish friend from foe under the blinding light of the flares. A German MG-34 swept across one jeep column, forcing the raiders to scatter into smaller units. Several men reported hearing shouted commands in German, followed by coordinated flank movements, tactics suggesting the defenders had rehearsed for this exact kind of attack. The question that would haunt survivors for decades was simple. How had the Germans known the exact moment and direction of the SAS approach? To uncover a possible answer, historians later examined declassified ultra-intelligence files and post-war Luftwaffe infrastructure reports. 2 findings emerged. First, a recently redeployed German signals intelligence detachment had begun testing new high-frequency listening equipment near Benghazi, capable of detecting unencrypted vehicular ignition signals from miles away. Second, Luftwaffe engineers had installed improvised tripwire microphones, crude sensors placed along unused segments of the airfield perimeter. Modern analysts believe one of these devices may have detected the SAS team as they moved into position. Yet many veterans refused to accept a purely technological explanation. Some believed there had been a leak, perhaps from a captured British officer earlier that month or a compromised map reference. A few pointed to inconsistencies in the reconnaissance photos used during briefing sessions. Captain Jellicoe later wrote in his private notes, "The Germans were not merely alert. They expected us." As the firefight intensified, the raiders realized the mission was no longer salvageable. With the airfield fully awake and reinforcements arriving from nearby barracks, the only viable choice was withdrawal. The retreat was frantic, illuminated intermittently by German flares and tracer fire that stitched the night sky. Several jeeps became separated in the confusion, forcing men to navigate by instinct and memory alone. Despite the chaos, small groups managed to regroup at prearranged rally points south of the airfield, guided only by the faint whine of a distant desert wind. But not all teams made it out. One section, 4 men in a single jeep, was last seen veering east under heavy fire, attempting to escape through a narrow corridor between 2 ridges. When the survivors conducted a head count hours later, the jeep was missing entirely. No radio signals. No burned wreckage. No bodies. Just a blank space on the map. And as dawn broke over the desert, the surviving SAS men realized that the unanswered questions at Burqa were only the beginning of a deeper mystery, one that would follow them across the sands as they pushed toward their next rendezvous point. The desert, it seemed, had more secrets to reveal. The desert has always been a place where men can vanish without a trace, but in December 1942, the disappearance of an entire SAS jeep section during the retreat from the Burqa airfield took on a more disturbing dimension. What vanished that night was not merely a vehicle, it was a vital piece of the mission's continuity, for highly trained men whose fate would remain one of the most unsettling mysteries in the early history of the Special Air Service. As the surviving raiders regrouped in the cold pre-dawn hours, the missing jeep hung over them like a shadow, raising questions that no one could answer. The retreat itself had been a frantic scramble. After the German flare exposed their approach and machine guns erupted along the perimeter, SAS teams were forced into small, scattered escape routes across the dunes. Each jeep followed pre-planned trident patterns, northwest, southeast, and south, intended to confuse pursuers. But the chaos of the firefight disrupted the choreography. In the confusion, Lieutenant Harris's jeep was seen veering east, its engine revving sharply as it dodged tracer fire sweeping across the ridge line. That was the last confirmed sighting. When the survivors conducted their head count at Rally Point, Fox, Harris, Trooper Beckett, Trooper Lane, and driver-mechanic Farrow were missing. Historically, North African raids often resulted in isolated losses, but the circumstances surrounding this particular disappearance were unusual. The area east of Burqa was rugged but navigable, dotted with shallow wadis and low escarpments that provided temporary cover. Yet search teams found no sign of the jeep, no wreckage, no tire tracks beyond a few initial impressions, and no spent cartridges suggesting a final stand. It was as if the desert swallowed them whole, Corporal McCree wrote in his diary. But the desert does not work that way. Tracks do not simply end. Fires do not burn without leaving charcoal. Metal does not disappear. As dawn rose, Captain Jellicoe ordered a silent return sweep along the likely withdrawal corridor. Moving with caution, the patrol found something that only deepened the mystery. A cluster of discarded equipment, 2 water bottles, a torn map, and a fragment of a leather dispatch case. None of these items bore bullet holes or burn marks. Stranger still, they were arranged in a neat line as if placed deliberately. Desert wind could scatter items, but it could not line them up. Someone had touched these objects after the fight. Adding to the tension, the search party discovered a set of footprints near the scattered equipment, 4 pairs, consistent with the missing men. But the footprints ended abruptly at the base of a slope, with no continuation on the other side. The wind might erase tracks, yes, but on that morning the breeze was gentle, far too weak to obliterate a full trail within hours. Even seasoned desert navigators were baffled. Driver Evans later reported, "It looked like they walked into a wall of air." To understand what may have happened, historians often point to the German long-range patrols operating in the region. Among them was Aufklärungsabteilung 3, a reconnaissance unit known for its stealth and desert tracking. They employed methods inspired by North African tribes, moving single file to hide their numbers, using canvas-wrapped boots to soften prints, and carrying lightweight metal frames used to drag behind vehicles to erase tracks. If such a patrol had intercepted Harris's jeep, it could explain the lack of conventional signs of combat. A swift capture without gunfire was not impossible. But the absence of tire tracks from any German vehicle deepened the enigma. No grooves, no oil drips, no spilt fuel, nothing to indicate pursuit or capture. It was as though the missing jeep had been lifted rather than driven away. Some veterans later speculated that a Luftwaffe field unit operating a camouflaged repair truck might have seized the vehicle, towing it off-road with a chain. This theory gained traction when post-war German logs revealed that a captured British jeep with unusual armament had been examined at an airfield near Bars in early 1943. Whether this was Harris's jeep is still debated, as the logs were sparse and partially redacted. The possibility of defection was briefly considered but dismissed. Harris and his men had sterling records, and no evidence emerged suggesting disloyalty. Still, the lack of bodies troubled investigators. In North Africa, death leaves signatures, jackals, birds, scavenger tracks. Yet the desert offered only silence. The most chilling clue surfaced 2 days later. Another patrol located a partially burned section of canvas, a seat cover from an SAS jeep, wedged between rocks nearly 20 kilometers from the last known position. The burn pattern was uneven, almost surgical, as if ignited with accelerant but extinguished prematurely. No other debris accompanied it. To this day, historians debate whether the canvas indicated an attempted concealment, a hasty abandonment, or a staged destruction. Reflecting on the disappearance, modern military analysts point to an overlooked factor: the rising sandstorm that night. Meteorological reports from RAF Gambut confirm a localized Khamsin gust front moving unpredictably across the region. Such storms can obscure tracks, disorient drivers, and reshuffle the desert surface. But even the most violent sandstorm cannot erase metal, men, and an entire jeep. Something else had intervened. The fate of Harris's team remains one of the SAS' most puzzling wartime mysteries. Their disappearance marked the moment when the raiders realized they were up against forces not only reacting to them, but seemingly anticipating them. As the surviving men pressed southward to their next rendezvous, an unsettling question lingered with every kilometer of sand they crossed. Was the raid compromised from the outside or from within? Every military operation produces paperwork, after-action reports, intelligence logs, reconnaissance notes, and coded messages. But in January 1943, as the surviving SAS raiders limped back to their forward base near Kufra, the paperwork surrounding the failed Burqa and Tmini night raids revealed something far more troubling than tactical misfortune. Amid the dust-choked reports and scattered field notes, officers uncovered a trail of discrepancies, small at first, then increasingly glaring, that suggested the mission may have been sabotaged by a failure far deeper than any one night's miscalculation. The first irregularity surfaced when Captain Jellicoe compiled his account of the raid. He requested the reconnaissance photographs used during the pre-mission briefing, images taken by an RAF Spitfire PR unit only days before the operation. But when intelligence officers retrieved the files, Jellicoe noticed something he hadn't seen before. The date stamps were inconsistent. 2 photographs bore markings from December 10th, but the others, showing German aircraft positioned near the northwest dispersal area, were stamped December 3rd. The earlier set depicted more enemy vehicles than intelligence summaries had acknowledged. Either the Luftwaffe had repositioned aircraft, or the SAS had been briefed using partially outdated information. Neither explanation sat well with the officer who had lost men in the raid. In wartime North Africa, intelligence lag was not unusual, but the pattern emerging around the Burqa raid felt different. When Jellicoe cross-checked terrain details from the photos with the survivors' accounts, several landmarks didn't match. A line of fuel barrels seen in the December 10th photos was absent on the night of the raid. More concerning, 2 anti-aircraft pits visible in the earlier photos had been filled in by the time of the operation, only to reappear as active machine gun nests when the German flare illuminated the field. Someone had misread, misreported, or misrepresented the airfield conditions. Adding to the confusion, the cipher logbook for L Detachment, a document recording encoded communications between SAS Command and Cairo headquarters, had gone missing. The last confirmed entry was from December 14th, 2 days before the raid. After that, the remaining pages were blank, torn, or smudged beyond recognition. Trooper Alan Ward, who had handled cipher materials during the desert marches, swore he placed the logbook in its metal case before the retreat. If it didn't make it back, he later said, it was taken. Full stop. The possibility of the logbook falling into German hands raised urgent fears. Had Axis cryptographers extracted enough intelligence to intercept the raid? Further inconsistencies appeared in the fuel estimates. The jeeps that returned to base carried less fuel than their logs indicated, even accounting for the extended retreat. Mechanics later discovered that several jerry cans loaded onto the jeeps before departure had been partially drained. In a unit where every drop mattered, that detail struck like a silent alarm. A logistics error was possible, but draining fuel from an SAS Jeep was an inexplicable oversight, unless someone intended to limit the team's range. Historically, the British 8th Army was grappling with stretched supply lines during this stage of the campaign. But the SAS, operating independently, maintained strict internal controls to avoid such lapses. Captain Lewis had famously said, "A Jeep without fuel is a grave without a stone." His philosophy made the drained cans all the more suspicious. Then came the discovery that unsettled even the hardened investigators. An intelligence slip referencing the SAS' planned approach route, Route Silver, was found in a burned file pile at an abandoned Axis outpost near Antilat. The paper was heavily charred, its edges blackened, but legible enough to reveal coordinates disturbingly close to the real route used by Harris's missing Jeep team. Whether the document originated from a captured British dispatch or German reconnaissance remained unclear. But its existence hinted that the enemy might have known the SAS movements long before the flare lit the sky at Burqa. The deeper the SAS officers dug, the more redactions they encountered. When they requested access to Middle East Command signals intercepts for the week of the raid, they received heavily censored transcripts. Several lines were blacked out entirely with margin notes reading, "Classified beyond required clearance." For a unit whose survival depended on transparency, this secrecy felt like a betrayal. Lieutenant Stanning noted bitterly, "We were trusted to strike behind enemy lines, yet not trusted with the truth behind our own intelligence." One entry in the January 1943 post-operation analysis hinted at the concerns running through the higher command. Possibility of SIGINT compromise cannot be dismissed. Further investigation required. That investigation, if it occurred, never reached the SAS raiders themselves. Many suspected that the missing cipher logbook, the mismatched reconnaissance photos, and the mysteriously accurate German response at Burqa were not isolated incidents but symptoms of a deeper intelligence failure that headquarters sought to bury quietly. The most tantalizing lead emerged from an RAF officer stationed at Gambut, who recalled intercepting a Luftwaffe transmission referencing British night raiding vehicles detected before approach. The message, translated after the fact, mentioned ignition signatures and movement along the southern ridge. That the Luftwaffe could pinpoint the raiders so precisely suggested a level of coordination the SAS never anticipated, possibly aided by compromised Allied communications. Looking back, modern analysts argue that the anomalies surrounding the December raids illustrate the vulnerabilities of early Special Operations Forces, brilliantly daring in the field but reliant on broader intelligence frameworks that were often fragmented or flawed. The men who survived Burqa believed someone had failed them, whether through bureaucratic negligence, intelligence leaks, or accidental oversight. The documents and redactions pointed to a disturbing truth. The deeper one looked, the more questions surfaced. By late January, the official narrative framed the raid as a tragic but ordinary operational failure. Yet inside the SS, the men whispered another belief. Someone had known things they shouldn't have. And someone had ensured that knowledge never saw the light of day. As they prepared for their next deployment, an uneasy thought lingered over the unit. If the enemy had been one step ahead this time, what might they already know about the missions to come? By the end of World War II, thousands of operational files cluttered the archives of British Middle East Command, weather reports, decrypted transmissions, casualty lists, and endless after-action reviews. Yet among that vast paper trail, the documentation concerning the December 1942 SAS night raids remained strangely thin. Pages were missing. Others were heavily redacted, damaged, or sealed under restricted access protocols that lasted decades beyond the war. To many within the regiment, it felt as though the desert itself hadn't merely swallowed men and jeeps, but the truth as well. In 1945, as Europe emerged from the wreckage of conflict, surviving SAS veterans were summoned for routine post-war debriefings. These interviews were meant to catalog operational lessons, record tactical innovations, and gather personal recollections. But when the Burqa and Tmini night raids came up, officers encountered a puzzling response. Several intelligence officers insisted the files were under review or pending transfer to another department. In reality, the same documents had already been quietly routed to the War Office's most secretive branch, MI9, where they would remain sealed for years. For the men who had lived through the chaos of the raid, this silence was infuriating. Lance Sergeant Thomas Mayfield recalled in a taped interview decades later, "We risked everything out there and suddenly no one wanted to talk about it. As if the whole thing had never happened." Veterans sensed that someone, somewhere up the chain, feared the implications of acknowledging how deeply the operation had been compromised. When fragments of the Burqa files finally surfaced in the 1970s, they confirmed what many had suspected. Entire sections had been culled, rewritten, or blacked out beyond recognition. Missing reconnaissance photos, gashed cipher logs, mismatched patrol reports, none appeared in the released documents. Instead, the files offered a sanitized narrative describing the raid as a miscalculated operation complicated by unfavorable weather and enemy awareness. But several handwritten notes, accidentally left unredacted, hinted at a different story. One margin comment read, "Potential SIGINT breach unresolved." Another noted, "Further investigation not recommended due to lack of verifiable source material." In other words, the truth was too inconvenient to preserve. And yet, despite the official obfuscation, eyewitness accounts continued to surface. Many veterans gave interviews in later years, piecing together segments of the raid with surprising consistency. The mysteriously alert German defensive positions, the unusual patrol patterns deep in the desert, and the unexplainable disappearance of Lieutenant Harris's team. These personal testimonies painted a more haunting portrait than any government file. Men spoke not only of tactical failures, but of the creeping sensation that the enemy had known their moves before they made them. Some pointed to decrypted German transmissions intercepted months after the raid. One message referenced a captured British raiding vehicle with special armament, while another mentioned advanced detection of motorized infiltration along the southern approach. Whether these messages referred to the December operation remained a matter of interpretation. What is certain is that the Luftwaffe and Afrika Korps were experimenting with new detection techniques at the time: ground microphones, early radio triangulation, and aerial monitoring by slow-flying reconnaissance aircraft. These innovations, if successfully tested, could have given the Germans the edge they needed. Still, a purely technological explanation could not account for every detail. The Luftwaffe did not know the exact timing of most SAS operations, nor did they have an established pattern for predicting the regiment's movements. That these particular airfields were reinforced at precisely the right moment, within hours of the SAS approach, remained a statistical oddity. Even post-war German officers admitted as much. Hauptmann Wilhelm Keitel, interviewed at a POW camp in 1946, said, "The British desert raiders were unpredictable. We never knew where they would strike. Except once." The remark raised eyebrows among Allied interrogators. Yet follow-up questions reportedly yielded no further clarity. Another thread involved the missing cipher logbook, still unaccounted for after the war. If it had been captured, even partially damaged, German cryptographers might have extracted enough clues to anticipate the general area of the raid. What troubled historians, however, was the British reluctance to release internal memos surrounding the incident. When researchers filed requests to view the related archives in the 1990s, several were denied on grounds of national security. Considering the raids occurred more than half a century earlier, such secrecy felt disproportionate. It suggested the files contained sensitive material, not about enemy activity, but about Allied errors or internal failures. Modern analysts reviewing the case argue that the truth likely lies at the intersection of several factors: compromised communications, flawed reconnaissance, and a German defensive network more sophisticated than previously acknowledged. Yet they also note that the British command's decision to restrict access to the files for so long cast shadows over the official account. For the surviving SAS veterans, however, the debate was never about assigning blame. It was about honoring the men who vanished in the dunes: Harris, Beckett, Lane, Farrow, and the others who never returned home. Their loss represented more than a tactical failure. It embodied the uncertainty and human cost of operating in the murkiest corners of military intelligence. As the decades passed, the story of the December raids became a quiet legend within the regiment, spoken of in training camps, referenced in lessons on operational security, and reflected upon by new generations of soldiers. It remains a reminder that even elite forces, operating with courage and precision, can be undone by unseen forces. A stolen document, a misinterpreted intercept, a single radio leak, or a subtle shift in enemy behavior. In the end, the desert keeps its secrets. And among those secrets lie the unanswered questions of a night when the SAS fought not only against the Germans, but against an invisible threat, one that seemed to move just ahead of them, step by calculated step.